interesting, but it might put our audience to sleep. Okay. Is this working all right? Everyone can hear? Excellent. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today to discuss delivering on the climate agenda. I'm Audrey Chad, Director of Research at the Global Risk Institute, and your moderator for today's session. We have three fantastic speakers with us today. Catherine Bakos, Director of Climate Finance and Science at the University of Waterloo's Intech Center on Climate Adaptation. Keith Robertson, Vice President of Environmental and Social Risk at RBC. And Alison Slater, Managing Director of Sustainable Investment Public Markets at Manulife Investment Management. I'll be introducing them as we go along, and there will be time for Q&A at the end of the session. So there will be a mic runner available in the audience, so please, we invite you to ask your questions towards the end of this session. So let's get straight into it. Alison, you lead the sustainable investment and ESG activities in Canadian public markets at Manulife Investment Management, which serves institutional, retail, and retirement clients across global markets. Tell us about your role and the segments that of the organization that you interface with and your mandate at the organization.
Sure. So it's such a long title because it helps situate where I am in the organization, and maybe some of your larger firms are like that as well. So Manulife, the parent company, the insurance company, has their own sustainability team. And then I'm in the GWAM business, which is owned by Manulife, but the investment management business, where we're further divided into public markets and private markets. And in public markets, we've got a team of about 15 of us on the sustainable investment team. We report into a chief sustainable investment officer. And there's about 15 or so on the private market side reporting into their own chief investment officer. And I'm told those two talk from time to time. But we have different governance committees that provide oversight for our work. And I think it makes sense because the private markets team, for example, the sustainability issues related to infrastructure, real estate, timberland and agriculture, those are some of the private market assets that we own, operate, or manage, are very different than the sorts of things we deal with in the public markets, which is just equities and fixed income, really. So the way we're looking at sustainability is just sort of a different skill set. So it's a pretty big organization. Our team is spread in all the markets where we have investment professionals. So we've got folks here in Toronto, also in Montreal. We own the John Hancock business for anyone with any U.S. experience in the kind of the eastern seaboard of the United States. So we've got a couple colleagues there in Boston, and then we've got folks spread through Asia, where we have some of our portfolio managers sitting. So that's the way we've designed our team, mainly to support our investment professionals, so the portfolio managers themselves. They're our main, client, I guess you could say. And I spend a lot of my day with them. Also spend a lot of my day with legal compliance. My colleagues, risk, I sit right beside the risk guy at Manulife Investment Management. And with sales, and the distribution team, a lot of this, a lot of the demand for sustainable investment, of course, we wouldn't have a team if clients weren't asking for it. And so I spent a lot of time working with the various different, sales channels that are reaching out, interfacing with new and existing clients who want to know more about what's going on in their portfolios when it comes to ESG or sustainability. And we do have a link a little bit to the parent company through things like, what do they call them, centers of excellence, where any of us working on climate or ESG will meet from across the firm, and I'll meet the folks from the insurance unit and the corporate sustainability team and others, and we share experiences and share knowledge across as we can. Sometimes there's firewalls that makes it easier for me to talk to someone like Keith probably than my own risk team in the company, which often baffles me, but they're there for good reasons. But so we do have some connectivity and then some alignment, I guess, on the vision and mission when it comes to sustainability from the parent organization.
Thank you, Alison. Now, Keith, you lead the risk management team responsible for integrating environmental and social risks into frameworks and policies. Your team is also responsible for the measurement of financed emissions, establishing emissions targets, among other climate risk management functions at the bank. So tell us a bit more about your overall team mandate and the vast growth that you've had over the past 2.5 years.
Yeah, thanks very much, Audrey, and thanks everyone for joining today. So I might start with, this was not the role I came into. I joined as within an enterprise risk team that did things entirely different to E&S risk, and was handed to people who reviewed environmental transactions, and that's sort of where it started, and it just grew and grew and grew from there. I don't know if you remember when Greta sailed across to the UN. That to me was the sort of the point at which things just took off and have never slowed down. And since that point, the space has evolved, and with that has come, the questions around ESG or climate specifically, and so it started with questions around financed emissions, and so my team just happened to have the types of skills and so on needed to start that journey around calculating financed emissions. So that was a journey we went on for a couple of months, and then it started to get into, okay, well, how do we start thinking about targets? And so we then pivoted across to that, and as we're going, we're adding and building resources to the team to be able to accommodate that. And then we started getting into, and how do you start implementing the types of commitments we were making or things we were saying publicly into our frameworks and policies and procedures to make sure that we could back those up and support them with policies that ensured the business was operating in a manner that ensured we would be able to meet and support those. So that's sort of how the team has grown. I mean, it started off with 2 people, it's now north of 30, and I would say still lots of room to grow, as much room as I'm given. So here I'm fingers crossed. We continue to see advancements around measurement, and I would say really getting more into what I would call climate risk analytics rather than just straight up emissions measurement. And to me, climate risk analytics includes things like climate scenario analysis. You're starting to get into your physical risks and measurement and looking at that across your enterprise, within portfolios, within businesses, within regions, really trying to understand where these risks may lie. I think they're quite often preconceived ideas about how much or how little risk there is in this space. And sometimes I would argue we just don't know until we've proven it otherwise. And so trying to get to that space where we can identify whether there is or isn't a risk today, and then setting up capabilities that allow us to continue to monitor that and how it evolves in the time moving forward. Because I would argue that we are seeing changes, and that is going to impact our portfolios differently as things evolve. And so we've sort of got to try and be one step ahead of the game in order to be able to manage this risk going forward. So I don't see the space slowing down, not for a couple of years. There's plenty of regulations still coming out or being finalized. We're seeing methodologies evolving or being published for the first time, expansion in the scope of work and things we need to comment on. Things like ISSB and so on coming out with IFRS 1 and 2. Like there's a lot of work that comes out of this, and so I think this is a space that's just going to continue to expand in the years ahead.
Thank you, Keith. That gives us a really good flavor for how the organization has evolved as various institutions are at different points in their evolution of the ESG space within their institution. Catherine, as Director of Climate Finance and Science at the University of Waterloo's Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, your work is advancing the business case for climate adaptation and is driving novel insights at the intersection of climate change and finance. Tell us about your role at the Intact Center and some of the highlights of your research.
Of course. Well, thanks so much, Audrey, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Intact Center, we're actually an applied research center out of the University of Waterloo that helps homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events. So that's particularly in relation to flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat, and under my personal domain of engaging with institutional investors, credit rating agencies, securities commissions, regulators, and supervisors in incorporating the physical risks of climate change into investment and business decision making. So some key projects that I've worked on with our team at the Intact Center include the first ever quantitative analysis in Canada, looking at the impact that flooding has on the Canadian housing market, and there is an impact. As well as developing a framework to help institutional investors and other financial market participants to identify the key physical climate risks on a per industry sector basis and what measures businesses should be doing to put measures in place to reduce those risks, which I'll be talking a little bit more as we go on today, a report that we just released. So it's a pleasure to be with you all.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. So Keith, as you highlighted earlier, you have a fairly broad mandate that spans different aspects of climate risk, each of which is in varying stages of maturity. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced, and how have you navigated those?
So I think the list of challenges is fairly lengthy, so we'll just touch on some of them. I think anyone familiar with this space would, typically the first starting point is always data. Data has been a real challenge. We don't have 30 years of financial data to review and assess and slice and dice and analyze and so on. So data has been a real challenge. What we've spent a lot of time and effort doing over the last 2 to 3 years is looking to improve that data as best we can. And in some instances, that's simply trying to find third-party data providers who can provide us with a broad suite of data that's better than what we have access to today. In other instances, it's looking at where there is publicly available data or where we can get data directly from our clients. So we've undertaken a lot of work to reach out to certainly clients in those key high-emitting sectors, to reach out to them and ask them for, do you have any emissions data? Do you have a transition plan? What are your priorities or your plans around transitioning to at least a greener economy? Maybe not even net zero for some of them, but at least a greener economy. And so that's a lot of data that we've managed to feed in, and that's helped us really get our data up to a better level. With that, we've then been able to look at where we do have good representation across the portfolio. How would one of our portfolio factors compare to what might be available in the market? So PCAF is the typical standard that most people would reference. And PCAF is not necessarily unique to a specific region or geography or subsector. It does depend on the what you're looking to achieve. And so where that's made sense, we've really tried to create our own groups where we can come up with what we think is a more accurate representation of the emissions for other names that perhaps haven't yet disclosed in that space, and use that to enhance the data within our portfolio. We continue to work on data. I am positive that it's only going to get better with the increasing disclosure requirements. I think there's still a lot of inconsistency in methodologies and measurement practices and so on. But I think with time, hopefully that inconsistency will start to iron out and we'd see more convergence to more standardized approaches. I think another challenge that we've had is, although I think we've managed to work through it very well, is just around resourcing. So that's hiring in people with the necessary resources or skills to do the work that we need them to do. And as I touched on earlier, there's a lot of quantitative work that we do, but there's also been a lot of other work around sort of what I just defined as the more qualitative aspects, and that's sort of client-related qualitative aspects, of whether you're starting to get into how you might score different clients or borrowers from looking through an ESG lens, how you might think of transition plans or how you engage with clients. And then there's sort of another, almost more of a governance element to it around ESG regulations, policies. I think go back, I think it was about 12, 18 months ago, it just seemed like it was almost every week we had a consultation paper coming out from one of the regulators around the world, which some of them were fairly lengthy, some of them a little bit shorter, but there was a huge amount of work and effort put into that. And so, for some of the hiring challenges that we had, we were lucky enough to be able to acquire people who had some ESG background. I would say the general rule, though, was hire people with good underlying skills, strong performers, in particular those who are adaptable, happy with uncertainty, like a real challenge, can pivot quickly as situations demanded, and then try and train them up on sort of the ESG matters that they needed to become more familiar with. I think regulations have, I touched on it previously, regulations has been another area that's been challenging, I would say, for different reasons. In some cases because there was really a lack of regulation, and not that one wants to structure one's workbook and priorities around regulations, but they do provide some guardrails and guidance as to at least what minimum requirements are, sometimes direction of travel in terms of future expectations. I think now that we're seeing more of those regulations being finalized, some of those draft guidelines, moving further along, we're starting to feel like we're getting a little bit more clarity there, which certainly helps. Again, I think this is a space that's going to evolve over time, and we'll see further improvements there. I do think there's still challenges around regulations in that we could certainly benefit from more convergence in that space. As a global organization, we span multiple geographies, and the speed at which different regulators move is different. What they focus on is very different. The level of granularity or requirements they have is different. And so trying to set up a practice that can serve as an enterprise as a whole, which I would argue this is a global problem that we need to solve. It's not necessarily individual entities. But I think trying to get greater convergence there and alignment across regulators will, I think, help all industries in looking to achieve their targets. So that's probably some of the key ones. There are others, but maybe I'll leave it there, and happy to take questions on any others that people have later on.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, that gives us a really good flavor for some of the challenges that organizations have been facing, particularly as we see, many teams have set up climate centers of excellence or ESG centers of excellence. And so, Allison, I know you've done a lot of work across various teams throughout the organization. And what do you seek to achieve through the various interactions that you have with the various teams? And what's your secret to achieving collaboration from various departments and gaining buy-in from these teams?
Oh yeah, that's that's that ability to influence and maybe more importantly add value to their work is I think half the battle for us. Same thing if you think of the growth from those original 2 people now to 15. Back in the early days, we were doing the ESG work for the portfolio managers, right? So here's how you integrate physical climate risk into your financial assessment of this company. We would do the work. We would find the data. We would do the work. We'd work with the portfolio management team, show them that. I mean, now 60 portfolio managers, $775 billion in assets under management, 15 people. We can't do that work anymore. So what it's been over the last 5 years is more about integrating, whatever ESG or sustainability, into the daily work across the organization. So making sure those portfolio teams, so instead of doing the work for them, making it easy for them to do the work themselves. So putting together an internal structure that every portfolio manager has to make it through 5 levels of ESG integration, and at the end they have to present to the chief investment officers. It's a big deal to get that level 5. Make it a big deal. Make the chief investment officer, reward them for that. Make it a part of their compensation. They need us along the way to support and educate, but sooner or later, they need to run with it. They know the company's best. They know their sector's best. They know how they can integrate ESG into their own specific sort of the way they look at companies through a financial lens and maybe a macro lens, even better than we ever will. So our job is to set up those frameworks, get the leadership buy-in, who rewards and finds this important, sends the signals, make sure they've got the data to the best of our ability. And we do a lot of that work, curating a data set, making it flow across their screens, they've got it there at their fingertips. And that's where we started, I guess, was ESG integration in the investment teams. And I spent a lot of my time in client presentations where you have the client saying, well, this is a great bond portfolio, but what are you doing on the ESG? Why do you own all this oil and gas? Next thing you know, they're carting me out to be a part of it. So once the client starts asking, it actually happened just the other day, the most important client for one of our portfolio managers sent like a 20-page ESG due diligence questionnaire. And the portfolio manager came to me and said, what is this? Are they unhappy with us and our ESG? Is this? And I'm like, this is the new normal. Like I'm doing one of these a week. Like this is the new normal. And he's like, this is a really important client for us. I'm like, so we got so far with them on the ESG integration. I'm like, all right, let's get this one done. Looking forward to sitting down with you to figure out how we can, that was 2-3 years ago that you got to your level 5. What's beyond that? How do you stay on the cutting edge? How do you stay above? How do you impress your client with the things you're doing on ESG that add value to their portfolio, reduce risk, get better performance out of the companies in there, and show that you're on it in terms of that leadership thinking. So that helps when there's the client demand, when there's the leadership incentive. And then I spend a lot of time with internally as well. Same thing, we can't be the legal, we can't compliance, we can't design all the products, all the sustainability products coming out. We can't do it all. So we're trying to more build the capacity in those units to build out their own special expertise, that legal mix with ESG, that compliance mix with ESG, that product mix with ESG, whatever it may be. So we're there informing, supporting, a part of it, but trying not to do it anymore. Since we're set up as a center of excellence, a little bit different than in your role. So those are some of the options that firms have. So as a center of excellence, we're trying to amplify with the small amount of resources that we have, but no longer do, and this is hard, especially on things like data where we have a lot more expertise or et cetera. I probably find myself too deep in some of these things half the time. My boss saying, pull back, that's compliance's role, and that's your whatever, that's the reporting team's role, or that's, so pull back. So it's just trying to educate, and and actually half the time, just to compliment the colleagues, I'm kind of amazed at the depth of knowledge that I'm starting to see in those different functions and different units. So you're getting those ESG experts not only on our specific team, but starting to be spread across, like the risk team are some of the most savvy ESG professionals in our organization. They're running daily risk report. They've integrated ESG directly into that daily risk report for the portfolio managers. They've done scenario analysis using the data that's available, climate value at risk, for example. And so they've sort of done that. And at the beginning, we were deeply involved in all of that. Now it's like I haven't heard from them in months. That means they're just running it and it's going well. So I think leadership helps. I think the fact that there's a client demand helps, and just having that discipline internally to sort of help and then know when to pull away, because otherwise you'll be doing the work of. There just isn't enough hours in the day at one point. You just need to have that. And then that's more true integration, where you have the organization really building out the expertise across the different business units.
It's also that maturity in the second line of defense, which I think when things are in the real sort of fledgling stage, you get a lot of combined first, second line activities happening. I think as you're sort of articulating, that's now going off to compliance and they're doing their piece, and people's roles and responsibilities get that much clearer.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good sign of a capability that's maturing across the organization. Yeah.
And you hit some bumps along the way, but.
Oh yeah.
I want to dig a little deeper now into the measurements and the matrices and the analytics around some of the climate risks that we're speaking of. And so, Catherine, as you reflect on Keith and Allison's responses and their practitioner experience, what can asset managers, banks, and insurers and other financial institutions do to engage their teams and have those deep conversations about the right material risk issues? And more specifically, as climate change continues to manifest as extreme weather, how can businesses identify and manage the physical risk of climate change that have or will have impact on operations at site level and across supply chain? So I know that's a lot there. Yeah. I threw that over to you, and I know you have a lot of background on this topic. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to hear all the work that's being done from an operational perspective and just looking more specifically into the investments themselves. But one thing I really do want to highlight is that it is urgent that the physical risks of climate change be better incorporated into investment and business decision making. So historically, it's always been about transitioning to a greener economy. That's what's taken precedence. And yet we know from global authorities like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that a certain degree of climate change is priced into the system, and so we're not going backward on the climate file. Climate change is irreversible. So mitigating against greenhouse gas emissions is incredibly important. We have to do those calculations and understand that, but that's not going to stop or reverse climate change from happening. It's only going to slow the worst impacts of climate change in the future. And so we really have to start thinking about physical climate risk kind of equaling the playing field in that discussion. And so what I still notice, though, is when I listen to business leaders, obviously not the two of you, because it's wonderful to hear that the physical risk of climate change is part of your analysis. But when I hear most business leaders or investors or politicians or even the media, there is still so much of a focus on that mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And so what I think about in regards to investments, so I think about business operations, again, at that site level and across supply chains, You can mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions all you want, but your business operations at site level and across supply chains will still be impacted by the physical risks of climate change. So if I'm an investor, I'm exposed to the physical risks of climate change. And so we need to do a better job at identifying and not just performing scenario analysis. Scenario analysis is great, but I actually think we can go a step further. And so we need better ways to identify exactly what are the physical climate risks that are going to impact businesses operating within industry sectors, and what measures need to be put into place to reduce those risks. So it's not just about risk identification, it's about risk management. And so we have globally available frameworks and standard setting bodies such as, and Keith, you mentioned the International Sustainability Standards Board, and that's a great place to start. It's a foundational layer of data that we should be disclosing, but in my opinion and in my experience, we can actually go a step further. And so that's the work that the Intact Center is working on. We're working on developing, or we have developed, a globally scalable framework that can be applied across industry sectors that complement disclosure standards and frameworks, and that we've dubbed the climate risk matrices. So the climate risk matrices are the foundation for a report that we actually just released in collaboration with GRI. And the report is transitioning from rhetoric to action, incorporating physical climate change and extreme weather risk into institutional investing. And so what are the climate risk matrices? Well, the climate risk matrices offer what the key physical climate risks are that a business could be exposed to within a given industry sector, how those physical risks will manifest at site level or across supply chains, and what measures need to be put into place to reduce those risks. So we've created 6 of these climate risk matrices to show that they can be created on scale for industry sectors such as utilities, commercial real estate, and financials. But what's the benefit of these? What's the benefit of these climate risk matrices? Well, in one page, and so literally it's per industry sector, it's on one page. So it's not a 100-page disclosure document like some reports. This is a one-page document that identifies, so it's a template for businesses that they can, if they operate within an industry sector, they can say, these are my key physical climate risks, and this is what I should be doing. There's 100 things that you can be doing in regards to physical climate risk, but most businesses are not going to have the assets or the resources, money, and time to allocate resources to accomplish all of those initiatives. What are the top 1 or 2 things I need to be doing to ensure that change is made on the ground and we're building resilience within our business operations? Also, this is a benchmark for investors, so they can be asking the questions of issuing companies. Have you identified these as your main risks, and are you putting measures into place to reduce those risks? If either of those answers are no, I've not identified my risk, and no, I'm not putting these measures, at least these measures, into place to reduce my risk, then that's a red flag to an institutional investor to say, maybe I don't want to allocate assets to this company. Or if I'm another financial market participant, a financial institution, a bank, or an insurer, do I want to be providing you loans or insurance? Or do I want to be providing you loans and insurance at a higher rate or a higher insurance premium? So what the climate risk matrices offer is exactly what the market is requesting. We are now able to price risk and opportunity appropriately in the system.
That's great, Catherine, and it really, I think, speaks to, for those of you who attended our CRO panel earlier today, and when Piyush was talking about the shortage of tools to assess, monitor, and manage climate risk. Well, here's something that really resonated with me, because here's something off the shelf, readily applicable, and doesn't require a depth of expertise in climate to be able to apply to investment portfolios and lending and such. So thank you for that. But now I would like to get the practitioner's perspective on that. So Keith, over to you.
So I went through them, and I thought they were great. I mean, to your point, there's nothing worse than opening a 200-page document and having to trawl through it to try and find the important points. Mm-hmm. But I'd gone through the matrices and looked at some of the questions that were being asked, the mitigating actions, and I guess the obvious but not obvious thing is that it's all obvious, and it's very logical and sensible and very easy to digest. I think as we look at the work that we're doing within our organization and trying to progress across a number of all ESG fronts, this is yet another area, obviously very physical risk focused, but another area where we can look to take that type of information and make sure that's being captured within the within the questionnaires that we already have, within the documentation we're already requiring from our businesses. I mean, the matrices cover a broad spectrum. I think I sort of dived into the residential real estate one because this is something that really, this one worries me. And dived into that one and had a look at that and thought, well, this is very interesting. How do we try and leverage as much of this as possible as we look to move things forward? I still think we've got a lot of work to do on the physical risk side. I think residential real estate's a little easier to get your wrap your arms around because the location data is so much better within a residential mortgage portfolio compared to, say, in your wholesale portfolio where, if we're lending to Walmart, well, where's their physical risk data? I mean, they've got distribution centers, manufacturers, outlets, et cetera, globally for the most part. Like that's trying to wrap your arms around that footprint and what is their physical risk profile. And I guess to your point, have you thought about these questions? What are you doing about them? What about these risks? What are you doing to mitigate them? So, that's maybe an alternative approach to trying to get to the same answer. But certainly, we've got a lot more work to do in this space, but I do agree with you. Physical risk is one that I worry is going to sneak up on people faster than they think because we are seeing the changes come. And I think, Alice, in your world, insurance practices are going to start to change as we start to see these risks materialize more and more often. And so premiums will go up, or as we saw in Southern California, insurance companies will start backing out of the market. So I think it's a space where pay close attention, and I think the matrices are a great tool that we can use among all the other tools that we have as well. Like let's pull them all in and use them to help us.
And just quickly to your point, I think as well, if we want to ensure the insurability of the Canadian housing market, then what resources are available so we can deploy actions on the ground so we build resilience, so we can make sure that insurance and mortgages can still be provided throughout our country. And so again, that paying attention, that physical climate risk, I think is going to be incredibly important. But it's, again, not just about paying attention to it and identifying the risk. It's what are you doing? What actions are you actually putting in place to reduce those risks?
Yeah.
Allison, over to you if you have anything to add in terms of how you could see the climate risk matrices being adopted and used within your organization.
Yeah, well, we invest in 10,000 companies around the world. So, and we, for example, we just deployed sort of a standardized ESG research framework. And so what the analysts are trying to do is kind of get a snapshot. So, of course, analysts, there's two types of research. There's the deep dive that they do. They know the company really well. They know them for years. And there's also sort of the snapshot level where they're trying to monitor KPIs and just sort of look for any outliers, look for any red flags. And they're trying to do this in a sea of data. There's a sea of data. There's more data available now than there ever has been, but it's difficult to use. It's scientific data about floods and fires and physical risk coming. It's unstructured, self-reported data from companies about their ESG risks and opportunities or just good things they're doing out there. And so it's just how to sift through and organize all this. So what I liked about the framework is that it's sector-based, which is the way analysts work. And it just brings to the surface, hey, here are your top 2 or 3 risks that are going to cost you from a physical risk standpoint, for this sector. So it just kind of gives you that, the priority spaces. And then that would allow our analysts to sort of, if they use that framework, find the data, it's probably out there, and sort of bring it into that order. And they're getting good at figuring out how that may impact the valuation of the company. So okay, oh wow, I see this company operating in Southeast Asia and has properties squarely in floodplains. So that could be very disruptive. The probability of that is A, and the cost of that is B, and we can adjust, we can see what that would mean in basis points, and we can adjust the valuation of the company through that. So this is a kind of very practical tool that I could see helps structuring a very unstructured world out there where we've got a sea of climate data and a sea of corporate data, and a lot of folks quite keen on trying to figure out how this may impact, their investments and what the pricing impact may be, but not sure how to bring that data together. So that's what I liked about the matrix, because it kind of gives you that framework, kind of connects the dots. It's also a great tool. You mentioned it in your remarks, Catherine. The other thing we do is we call these companies. So whenever we see a bit of an ESG risk that is concerning, that we think is a risk. We're not sure that they have it on their radar. We're not sure they have it under control. We call up the companies. We call this engagement or stewardship, where we call the company, hey, we own a lot of stock, we own a lot of your bonds, and it looks like you've got really important operations sitting in these floodplains or what, let's talk about it. What kind of data and information do you have on that? Can you provide us with? Maybe there's nothing, and then they work on it, and we call them back in 6 months and call them back in 6 months and see what's happening, or maybe there is a lot. Maybe they've done a lot. They just hadn't reported it, or we hadn't been able to find it out there somewhere. And this, we can have a dialogue. So this sort of gives us a script about the priority areas that we could, we can ask companies about physical risk, especially in those 6, and you've done the higher priority sectors as well, where physical risk is posing a particular threat. So that's quite helpful for us. So that's the way we could use tools like that, I think.
Excellent, Allison. And as both of you have sort of highlighted in your remarks, there's a number of skilled professionals that need to be brought into the picture within your organizations to undertake this kind of work. And that comes at a cost. So Catherine, I know you've done quite a bit of research around the cost-benefit analysis of the analytics and the resourcing. So can you tell us a little bit about that work and what your findings have been?
Of course. And so any initiative, whether you're adapting to the physical risks of climate change or you're mitigating against greenhouse gas emissions, any initiative within an organization is going to cost resources. So that's going to be time and money, and that's probably taking resources away from another initiative. So again, doing those cost-benefit analysis is going to be really important. What's the cost and what's the benefit to my organization? What's my return on investment? What do I gain as a company? So the rule of thumb is that for every dollar that you put into place for adaptation, you save $3 to $8 over a 10-year period in cost avoidance, and that's a conservative estimate. And I'm sure some of you are going to say, well, that's in cost avoidance. That's not a return on investment. I don't get that money back in hand, which in the essence, that's correct. But how I like to think about it is actually from an opportunity cost. For every dollar that I put into adaptation within my organization, I do not have to pay $3 to $8 out over the long-term period, and then that $3 to $8 can be allocated to another initiative. And given that we understand that the physical risks of climate change, they're going to continue to increase in severity, then the probability that your business operations at site level and across supply chains, the communities in which your business operates, your customers, your employees are going to be impacted by the physical risks of climate change. That probability is increasing. And so you have to remember, it's not just the $1 that you put into place for $3 to $8, that's compounding. It's you put the adaptation measure in place today, tomorrow an extreme weather event happens, it's protecting you, and the day after, and the week after, and the month after. And so every extreme weather event, that's $3 to $8 every single time that an extreme weather event happens. And so what I like to think about is when we talk about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and physical climate risk, those two conversations tend to be siloed. And we want to, how do we integrate those better? To me, this is an exact way of how we can do that. Every dollar of adaptation, $3 to $8 towards mitigation, and that's how I would think about it. Now, some of the research that we've actually done on the ground is doing case studies looking at publicly traded companies and how publicly traded companies, their share price is also impacted by physical climate risk. And what we've determined is that highly exposed sectors, so something like utilities, transmission and distribution lines, would be impacted by 20 to 25%. Medium impact sectors, consumer discretionary, retail would be impacted by about 10 to 15%, and low impact sectors, IT and healthcare, would be impacted by about 5 to 10%. Now, not knowing how much of that risk is already, the climate risk is priced into the system, we assume it's minimal because you tend to see material changes in stock price and share price when a climate change event happens. Now, the rebound effect, when do companies tend to rebound that share price? Well, that's dependent on the company themselves. We've also done analysis looking at when is the best time to adapt, now versus 3 years versus never. And what we've determined is it's obviously more cost effective to adapt now rather than later. So say you adapt in 3 years. Well, you could experience 2 extreme weather events at your business operations. That's $3 to $8 each time out the window. And so it's more cost effective to adapt sooner than later. And finally, we also have to think about, it's not just the financial costs, it's the social costs. Our customers, our employees, an extreme weather event happens, that's social costs, that's mental health costs. But in average, or in general, the rule of thumb is for every dollar in adaptation, you save $3 to $8 over the long-term period.
Thank you for that insight. And I'm going to pivot slightly towards the regulatory context, but I think it also ties into what you've just laid out in terms of starting to look at different outcomes, different costs, starting to look at scenario analysis, and that's something that obviously OSFI is now looking at for our Sched 1 banks and has implications for the wider financial institutions industry. So Keith, can you tell us a little bit about how the regulatory environment is sort of shaping or changing your plans?
So I think, as I touched on earlier, I actually find that with more of the regulations coming out now, there is some relief in the certainty that that's starting to provide, and the guardrails and the guidance that provides. I think in some instances, there are requests that come with that which are quite onerous with, I would say, just where ourselves and many other organizations are in our capabilities to provide that sort of data and information and analytics. In some instances, there's a sort of a nice graduated timeline, so that sort of helps navigate that. But I have liked the sort of the OSFI focus on risk management capabilities. Like, build up your capabilities, and then that'll start to take care of the risks themselves, as opposed to diving necessarily into very precise details about potentially splitting out every single line item in your P&L and what's climate and what's not. And that starts to look and feel very onerous, and I haven't yet got to the sort of the value add in that space. Maybe if I had more of an investment hat on, that would look a little different. But there's some very specific sort of expectations that are either about to come out or will come out in the future. So that overall, I think the clarity is nice, because then we can work with that and move forward. I would say a slightly different angle to the regulations would be what we're seeing south of the border, which is, if Europe is sort of really progressive and pushing hard on the requirements on the likes of financial institutions, south of the border, we're starting to get a bit of a two-tone approach to ESG, where there's the very pro-ESG states, and then we also have the very anti-ESG states. So one saying get out of coal, the other one saying you should be doubling down on coal. Trying to navigate that landscape is becoming increasingly more difficult, and so it does start to factor into your decision making in terms of how you think about disclosures, policies, making sure that you can do the right thing, but do it in a way that still allows you to conduct your business in an effective manner that is still consistent with the goals to decarbonize across the economy and move forward from an ESG perspective, trying to balance the E, the S, and the G across all three facets. I think sometimes there's a real focus on one particular element, and then one forgets that, hold on, but there's also a huge S impact to that, or vice versa. And trying to find that balance within the sort of the scope of the regulations is tricky, and it's going to remain a challenging area for some time to come, I think.
Perhaps touches on the unintended consequences that were chatted about in this morning's session. Allison, do you have anything to add, maybe from an ISSB perspective, that has shaped and guided your organization?
Well, maybe to bring a different angle. Well, why don't I start with ISSB translating into standards here in Canada? I'm on the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, so this is built in the same way that the IFRS has sort of a little sister organization here in Canada called the Financial Reporting and Accounting Standards Board, that takes IFRS standards and does their due diligence and then issues them in Canada as financial reporting standards. And then our regulators, I think there's at least 220 pieces of regulation that refer to those Canadian-issued IFRS standards. Okay, so that's how it works in financial reporting. So what they've done here in Canada is formed sort of a sister body to this financial reporting standard-setting body at the domestic level, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, thinking that we'll do the same thing, take those ISSB standards, perform our due diligence, maybe make some minor adjustments for the Canadian context, and then issue them in Canada as Canadian standards in the hopes that the regulators will then refer to those in regulation going forward. And then we have, we are a part of the global baseline. We're Canadian firms are reporting consistently as other firms around the world will. et cetera. But we have a very fractured regulatory system here in Canada. So we've got OSFI, who's already endorsed the ISSB and the CSSB, and they're on board, and they've signaled that very clearly for banks and insurance companies where they're going and what kind of reporting will be expected. But the securities regulators work at that province by province level. And that's where I worry that the wider set of issuers in Canada, outside of those FERFIs, the federally regulated financial institutions, all these, and these are all, it's all a mouthful. I worry that there may be, inconsistencies across the securities regulators across the province. So I do, as an outlook, that's an area of concern I have. I don't think that helps Canadian issuers in any way. I don't think that makes them more competitive to attract international capital. Most investment in Canada, like if you look at who owns our Canadian issuers, it's 80% international. So capital that owns our stocks in Canada is mainly international. They're going to expect our companies to be following these international norms and standards. So that doesn't help us if we don't have a clear, so you can see my area of frustration there. But another angle I wanted to just share, which has been so interesting, is the regulation evolving around green and ESG funds. And so you might have heard about some of this as well. So this is really interesting. So started in the EU, SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, was about if you have a fund and you want it to be a green or an ESG or in any kind of sustainability themed fund, they have set out very rigorous requirements for that fund to qualify, what they call as an Article 9 fund. So that's a green fund would be an Article 9 fund, or it could have a social objective, but it has to be the objective of the fund, the financial objective, and the sustainability objective has to be at the same level. And that's different than an Article 8 or an Article 6 fund, where the objective of the fund is financial and it integrates ESG, and Article 6 fund where there's no talk of ESG at all. So those are these three categories. So as a Canadian fund manufacturer, we're trying to make funds, that reach that highest level. So we've created and we manage out of Canada a climate action fund, and we've got it up to that Article 9 standard. You should see, under the hood. So not only do you have to be a climate leader to be in there, but you've got 20 more. So that's already a bunch of hurdles you have to pass as a company to be a climate leader. But then, according to the regulation, you also have to pass another 20 do no significant harm metrics. So this is no point in having a climate leader in there if they have child labor in their value chain out there somewhere, right? So it just sort of makes sense. So, okay, make sure they're not doing significant harm in other areas, even if those are outside of your focus for this fund. And finally, there's the good governance screen. Another 20 metrics and requirements that companies would have to pass, and just to make sure they have good corporate governance in place. And so we have a global fund. We've chosen stocks mostly from Canada and the United States to be in this Article 9 fund compliant with these European regulations. And so what are we doing? We're contacting Canadian companies with all these good governance and do no significant harm metrics that are maybe outside of what traditionally might be expected to be done here in Canada, that are different, maybe above and beyond what we might see as required in our corporate governance or in our the issues that tend to be a focus here in Canada. For example, we don't necessarily have the same sort of focus in Canada on the social issues, on human rights, as they do in Europe, and that's a big one. So interesting how those international regulations are starting to sort of, through us, starting to play out, are starting to impact and reverberate through non-European markets, to companies operating in non-European markets where we want to put those, we want to put your stocks or your bonds in some of these green funds. So there is that knock-on effect, that domino effect with these regulations. So it's not only those ones that are directly on, in your jurisdiction, but somehow the ripple effect and that global flow of capital is having, means regulations happening somewhere off in Hong Kong or Singapore or the EU in this case, are coming home to Canada and may be impacting, the expected performance of the company.
In some ways, it's almost like reducing to the lowest common denominator. And when that bar is set higher in other jurisdictions, it does really permeate into our local Canadian market. And so certainly we need to keep abreast and aware of those moving pieces. We only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to give each of our panelists a moment to Having spent the last 45 minutes or so exploring the elements and considerations of integrating climate risk into existing frameworks, risk management practices, and strategy, if you were to offer a call to action or some last words of advice to the practitioners we have in the audience today, what would they be? Catherine, let's start with you.
Obviously, my area of expertise, we have to urgently consider physical climate risk more of a priority. We have to be speaking about it more. We have to be identifying the risks and then taking action on those risks. So this needs to be an urgent requirement, part of our conversations. It's not just about mitigating greenhouse gases and transitioning to a greener economy. Our supply chains, our investments could all be impacted by the physical risks of climate change. So to me, that is incredibly urgent, and it needs to be more part of the conversation, but also we're very lucky. Resources are available. There are standards and frameworks that are available. There is research that is being done to how can we pinpoint exactly what risk could potentially impact businesses across industry sectors. And this is supported by subject matter experts. These are the individuals who know what they're speaking about. We just have to put action into place now.
Thank you, Catherine. Keith, over to you.
I think similar lines to Catherine, which is I think this is a space where one needs to be proactive. It's not one where one wants to wait until things are starting to happen, because by the time that really starts to take hold, it's going to take too long to catch up, and the costs are going to be significant. So this is one where I think today we would say the risks that we're realizing on a daily basis are not yet at a level that gives most organizations significant concern, but that's going to change. And so use this time to set up your practices, your processes, et cetera, to be able to manage risk, monitor risk, identify risk, mitigate risk in the case of some of the physical and the transition side of things. Use that time now to put that in place. It may seem like, again, your opportunity cost example, like, well, why do we have to spend the $1 or $2 on this? It's not because you're necessarily going to generate this massive return in the future, but you're going to avoid spending thousands and thousands of millions of dollars fixing things because things are going wrong in the future. And the disruption element, I think, I really worry about. So I think that, be proactive, drive hard, drive forward, and try and stay on top of this and keep it as a risk that we don't have to worry about on a day-to-day basis for the most part.
Allison, you get the last word before we go over to questions.
No pressure. This whole sustainability space is a little bit under fire at the moment. We kind of had some boom years where we could grow teams and we would kind of do everything we needed to do. And now we've got greenwashing risks. We've got green hushing as a response. We've got the U.S. situation that Keith described. We've got confused regulatory landscape. It's kind of it's a little bit under fire. And I feel like what's working in Manulife Investment Management is leadership, and leadership matters. So now that we've had the boom years, now that there's pressures, leadership is still standing strong on it. We've got the governance systems in place, governance and oversight systems in place. They're not budging, and we've got mature systems and processes in place. Just as you mentioned, build that system, whether it's in the risk unit, whether you're in the lending unit, whether you're in the investing unit. Just build those systems with the oversight, and I think right now we're withstanding the pressures that are coming from legal, from compliance, from outside. We're kind of still standing, and it's an investment. And people are saying, no, we're sticking with this. This adds value. These are real risks. This is we're doing nothing but deepening and holding on, even though we're sort of weathering some pressure at the moment. So leadership, governance, and systems will be the best investment you can make in the organization over time for this to truly add value to your organization over time.
Thank you, Allison. Couldn't agree more. So I'm going to open it up to questions from our audience. Are there any questions that you'd like our panelists to address? Yes, Rita.
It could be Keith or Allison's. My question, we've been, there's a lot of work being done on climate. But, I was curious about how you guys are thinking about the cross between different risk types, right? So climate versus social. And, we have, a lot of conversations, like, do you push towards solar when you know that, maybe that is, we heard from Neil about, it's all coming from China, and maybe there are, issues around human rights or forced labor situation, or, the other argument that we hear is, well, if we don't produce oil, some other autocratic country will. So, yeah, I was curious, can you share a little bit about, these cross impacts and how you are sort of valuing or building that into your work practice in terms of weighing trade-offs?
On our side, sometimes you feel like it's just, which is the lesser of two evils, sometimes. Actually, I was having a conversation about nuclear the other day. Canada and Ontario has doubled down on nuclear. There's no other option to reduce fossil fuels. But for the last 20 years, we've been trying to get off nuclear, because of the danger it poses and our inability to dispose of spent uranium safely. But now we're like, oh, maybe it's a lesser of two evil than fossil fuels, for example. So it kind of feels like in our daily life we're looking at those lesser of two evils, trying to steer through. I just go back at the end of the day and think, okay, well, we're the sustainability team. So what we're going to do is take the best possible position we can from a sustainability perspective, whether it be climate or on the social side or the mix of. And put that out as kind of, the goal in the end, and how we make investment decisions and align with that and other activities we can do. Can we get all the way there? Maybe we can't get all the way there, but there should be still that vision about where we've said we wanted to go and where we want to go. We want to get somewhere where we're safe from climate change and people are still thriving. There's got to be a way where we've got that human ingenuity. But I do feel like we do spend a lot of our days just with the trade-off, and every issue you get down to it. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about carbon capture. So is that just delaying, and prolonging the ability of fossil fuels to keep being produced essentially unabated, or is this an essential part of the green future and is gives us competitive advantage and does take a notch out of the emissions? I mean, these are the constant trade-offs. The science tells us so much, and I think in the end you still have to use that moral compass and just your decision making on what's that big picture view we're trying to get to, and what would be the best outcomes along the way that we would want to see. Very difficult, definitely.
Thank you, Allison. Keith, I'm going to ask you to respond to that as well, but I saw another hand at the back. So do you have anything immediately to add to that?
No, I would agree with what Allison
Okay,
said.
all right. So then I'm going to, well done, Allison. So I'll go straight to the back.
So let me finish off by asking you a question you can't possibly answer. We have this, I don't think there are an awful lot of climate deniers in this room, but there are a lot of climate deniers, and it's not just in the US. So that's in the way of all the work. What do we do? I mean, I'll just give, if you don't want to give me a political answer, I'll give you two practical realities. Wildfires are a problem. Province looks after them. We don't have enough equipment, water bombers and all that stuff to deal with it properly. Two, we haven't changed the zoning. People are still building residential, commercial, industrial, and floodplains. So if you got any thoughts about adapting to it is one thing. If you might know what the solution is, what do you do?
Again, I would say this is no easier than the question Allison just responded, where there are trade-offs in all of these. I mean, in some of these instances, it requires some tough decisions to be made. Like if you start changing zoning laws on where people can and can't build, some people will say, I don't care. I'm happy to build my house there. I don't care about fire risk. Like it's never going to happen to me until it does. And so I think, I would argue this point starts at the very top of government in any country, is there are some very tough decisions that I think need to be made around policy, regulations, zoning laws, right down to a very detailed level. I think the challenge that I always see with that is that there's a risk that the government making the right decisions, as I would say everyone in this room would say, unfortunately have a very good chance of being voted out because people don't want to be told what to do. I mean, we saw that through COVID. Like, don't tell me what to do. And I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. And truthfully, I don't know how we get there. My worry is that we will get there, but it will be at a point where it is so catastrophic that the damage is done. And so from what we can do within our organizations, I think, to what Alison was saying, it's do what you do, do what you believe is right. On the fringes, certainly we can change the way we operate and where we decide to put our funds or invest our dollars, etc. We don't have the mandate or the strength to make those policy decisions, and I would say that would be very dangerous to business in some cases. So try and do what we can on the fringes, but that is a really tough challenge. And I think does tie back into the trade-offs. Do you build more houses and sacrifice the biodiversity side of things, or do you leave the houses and cause social issues? There's so many elements at play here. So, what do you add to that?
Yeah, no, and I think talking about climate change and talking about protecting homes and communities could potentially be two very different conversations. And so you're talking about a very political issue, or it shouldn't be a political issue because it's science. The science is the science. But it has become a very political issue. But I work across Canada, and there are regions I go into. Yes, these definitely, when I show the science, there are people in the room who don't necessarily agree with me. And this isn't up for opinion. It's not my opinion. This is the science. But we don't have to talk about climate change. How can I help you help your family? How can I help you help your home to be more protected against the flood that just happened? Your home is now devalued because you now are being stigmatized by this community in which you live in that have experienced flooding. If you experience a wildfire, this isn't a devaluation of your home. Your home has been completely lost. Your community has been completely lost. And so how can I offer you resources to put measures into place at your level of the home? How can we work within municipalities to ensure municipalities have put measures in? Either we're building communities correctly and more resilient, or we're retrofitting them. And we know exactly what to do to make these communities more resilient. Now, of course, that costs a lot of money, but back to my point about for every dollar that you spend, you save $3 to $8. So in the long term, taxpayers are actually spending less money by becoming more resilient. So you want to pay less taxes, become more resilient. So these are conversations that I would tend to have. How can we make your home, your community more resilient, your businesses more resilient? And yes, we need to build 5.3 million homes across Canada with how much immigration is coming in to the city, but also to the country itself. How are we retaining natural infrastructure? Natural infrastructure helps attenuate the effects of flooding and extreme heat. Where are we building? Are we having conversations about strategic retreat, getting people out of harm's way? That's a very difficult conversation because you're talking about removing people from their communities. But is that ultimately where difficult decisions do have to be made, and municipalities have to make decisions that you actually have to get out of this community? Because I can't just keep one of you here. You have a right to choose where you want to live, but if only one of you stays and everyone else leaves, guess what? Infrastructure, sewage, mail, electricity still needs to come in. The taxpayers are still paying for that. And so it's a very big conversation, and you're correct, it's very politicized. But to me, it becomes very simple when I start talking about people's homes and people's livelihoods, and that's a little bit more relatable than this big, overarching conversation about climate change.
Very well said. Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to do a time check. Do we have time for one more question? That's it. Well, I think that I hope our audience today has got a really good, tangible sense of the discussion points and the types of conversations that need to start being had with their clients within their institutions. And I think what we can really do is take everything you've heard today, and especially the report that was recently released by the Intact Centre, and start putting that to use. So I'd like to, with that, thank our panelists today, Catherine, Keith, and Alison. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you.